The wind rustled through the pines like a whisper carrying secrets no one dared speak aloud. In the foothills of what the Apache called Zil-Ligai-Sian, White Mountain, Lina crouched low beside a moss-covered boulder, clutching her son to her chest. Her hair was matted with ash and sap, her dress torn at the hem, and her eyes, once wide with hope, now scanned the woods with the vigilance of prey. She hadn't spoken in 3 days, not since the riders came. They burned her husband's cabin to the ground, left his body near the riverbank, and scattered the family's few possessions like dust in the wind. She had fled with little more than a blanket and her 5-year-old son Tahoma. He had cried for his father that first night, but now he too was silent, perhaps learning in instinct what silence meant for survival. They lived now like animals, eating roots, rainwater, and the occasional rabbit snared by a looped shoelace. Lina had been raised among plains people, used to open skies and communal laughter, not shadowy trees and solitude. But she had chosen this exile rather than return to her own people with a dead husband and a child born of another tribe. Neither the white settlers nor the Apache wanted her now. She was an in-between, too native for one world, too foreign for the other. And yet, someone else was moving through the trees. He came like a ghost, barefoot, lean, with a bow slung across his back and a hawk feather tucked behind one ear. She saw him before he saw her. A young hunter, perhaps not even 20, his long black hair tied back with leather. His steps were soft, his breath steady. But then he turned his head suddenly, and their eyes locked. She froze, heart pounding. Tahoma stirred in her arms, sensing the tension. The hunter didn't raise his weapon. Instead, he lowered himself slowly, palms up, as if to show he meant no harm. Then he pointed to his chest. "Atsidi," he said softly. "I'm alone." The name meant metal worker in his tongue, a name carried by his grandfather and now by him. Lina didn't answer. Couldn't. Her throat was too dry, and trust was too expensive. But he sat down near her anyway, close enough that she could smell smoke on him, the clean kind that came from cooked meat. From his satchel, he pulled out dried deer meat and a leather flask. He held them out to her. For a moment, Lina didn't move. Then Tahoma reached out, hunger overwhelming fear. She let him take it. That was the moment something shifted in the hills. A woman who had given up on being found had just been discovered. Not by a rescuer, but by someone just as lost. Atsidi did not ask questions. He only waited, his presence quiet but grounding. And so began a fragile bond, one woven from hunger, grief, and the shared silence of the wilderness. That night, beneath the trembling light of a half-moon, Lina made the unthinkable choice. She let the stranger build a fire. The fear of smoke drawing eyes was nearly paralyzing. But the cold had grown unbearable, and Tahoma's tiny frame trembled against her chest. Atsidi didn't speak much. He gathered branches, peeled bark, and sparked flint like a man who had done it all his life. The fire crackled to life, casting flickers of orange across the trunks of towering pines. For the first time in days, warmth seeped back into Lina's limbs, though her heart remained wrapped in frost. Tahoma sat close, eyes wide as he watched Atsidi pull out a pouch of crushed herbs and drop them into a small iron pot of water suspended above the flame. The scent that followed, pine, mint, and something bitter, made Lina's eyes sting. Not from the smoke, but from the memory. Her husband used to brew something similar when the baby had a fever. Now the memory of his hands was a phantom pain. Atsidi finally spoke, voice low and steady, as if addressing the night rather than her. "You were hiding near the burial stones. I could hear the crows." Lina didn't respond. She watched him, wary. "I don't want your story," he added after a pause. "Just your silence. It tells me enough." Then he passed her a wooden bowl of the steaming liquid. She sniffed it, hesitated, then took a small sip. It was bitter, yes, but her bones welcomed the heat. "Thank you," she whispered, surprising even herself. Atsidi nodded but didn't smile. His eyes stayed on the fire, but he was listening. She could feel it. The three of them sat in silence then, Lina, her son, and the quiet hunter who neither pried nor offered answers. Just presence. In the firelight, Tahoma reached forward to touch Atsidi's feather, curiosity outweighing caution. The young man let him. A strange peace settled over them, the kind that grows in wild places when nothing is expected but everything is offered. Later, after Tahoma fell asleep nestled in Lina's lap, Atsidi finally looked up. "I know these hills," he said. "I know where water flows and where the snow hides the deer. I travel alone, but I don't mind shadows beside me, if they move quiet and true." He didn't ask her to follow. He didn't promise safety. He simply made space for her in the wilderness, like one makes space for a wounded animal, gentle, patient, without need for words. Lina said nothing, but her silence was no longer armor. It was a bridge. She stared into the fire, holding her son close, and knew one thing for sure. She was no longer entirely alone. And in that knowing, a small part of her began to thaw. At first light, the frost still clung to the grass like forgotten tears, and the smoke from their fire had long since vanished into the pines. Atsidi rose early, checking his traps, moving like mist between the trees. Lina watched him from behind a thicket, Tahoma still curled in sleep against her. She didn't understand why she hadn't fled the night before. Survival had taught her to trust no one. And yet, here she was, still here, still watching this strange young hunter who spoke little and asked even less. When he returned, he carried 2 hares slung by their feet, already gutted and cleaned. He tossed one to Lina without a word and began cooking the other over the still glowing embers. She didn't thank him this time. She just nodded and set to work. The rhythm of work, skinning, roasting, cleaning, was a language they both understood. And in that rhythm, some unspoken trust began to take root. But peace in the hills never lasted long. It was mid-morning when Atsidi paused mid-step, crouched low, and pressed his palm against the ground. "Riders," he said. One word, sharp and cold. Lina's breath caught. She dropped the sharpened stick she had been using and pulled Tahoma close. Atsidi stood, his face unreadable. "3 horses," he murmured, eyes scanning the ridge above them. They passed 2 valleys over, not close, but looking. Lina's heart raced. "Looking for what?" she asked, voice shaking. "You. Maybe me," he said. "Men who ride where no trail goes. They're not chasing deer." He motioned for her to pack quickly. There wasn't much, just a wrapped blanket, a bone knife, and a pouch of roots. Atsidi doused the fire with cold earth, brushed away their footprints, and led them into a new path. Narrow, rocky, overgrown with bramble. Not a road made for horses. As they climbed higher into the hills, the trees thinned, replaced by jagged stones and quiet wind. Atsidi moved with the ease of a fox, pausing only when Tahoma stumbled or Lina gasped for breath. Hours passed. The sun rose, then fell behind thin clouds. Finally, they stopped near a cleft in the rocks, half hidden by scrub pine and thorn. "We stay here," he said. "No fire tonight." Inside the crevice was barely enough room for all 3, but it was dry and smelled of sage. Lina tucked Tahoma into the blanket, her fingers trembling. "Do you think they'll find us?" she whispered. Atsidi didn't answer. He sat at the mouth of the crevice, knife in hand, eyes on the wind-blown trail below. That night, fear was a 4th presence. Heavy, quiet, always breathing at their backs. But Lina watched Atsidi, saw the stillness in his shoulders, the way he didn't flinch even as wolves howled far away. And somehow, despite the danger pressing in from every side, she felt safer than she had in weeks. Not safe, but safer. Because sometimes survival wasn't about walls or weapons. Sometimes it was about the people who chose not to leave. The wind was colder in the high ridges, sharp enough to cut through bone. The 3 of them stayed hidden in the rock crevice for 2 days, living off dried meat and silence. Atsidi left only once each morning and returned before midday, always with something, berries, pine nuts, or dried lichen that Lina soaked to make broth. He moved like someone born of the wild, with the silence of a hawk and the instincts of a wolf. But it was on the third night, as the stars blinked coldly overhead, that Lina finally broke the stillness between them. Tahoma had fallen asleep nestled between them, his small breaths soft against her arm. Lina glanced at Atsidi, who was carving a small piece of wood with a bone-handled blade, his face calm, his fingers steady. "You don't talk much," she said. Her voice cracked from disuse, and it startled even her. Atsidi didn't look up, but the corner of his mouth twitched. "Words are like arrows. You only use them when they matter." He paused in his carving and turned the small object in his hand. It was the shape of a bird, wings curled inward, eyes closed. "I learned that after the raid." Lina leaned forward, curiosity cutting through her caution. "Raid?" she asked. Atsidi nodded, then pushed back his sleeve to reveal a long scar across his forearm, jagged like a lightning strike. "They came at night," he said. "Riders from the south. I was 15. My father died trying to fight them off. My mother ran with my sister. I stayed behind." Lina traced the scar with her eyes, not touching but memorizing its cruel path. "You lost them?" she asked. "All of them," he said simply. "I buried what was left." There was no pain in his voice, only weight. It was the kind of story not told to earn pity, but simply because it lived too close to the skin. Lina looked down at her son, whose face still bore the roundness of youth, and felt her own ache rise to the surface. "I lost mine too," she whispered. "They said my husband was a traitor for leaving the settlement to trade with the mountain people. So they made an example of him." Her voice broke, and she pressed her palm against her mouth. Atsidi didn't offer comfort. He didn't need to. He simply placed the carved bird in her lap. "It's a dream bird," he said softly. "We believe it carries your thoughts to the ancestors while you sleep." Lina stared at it, the simplicity of the gift cutting through her like sunlight through mist. "Thank you," she said. "Not for the carving, but for the space, the listening, the unspoken understanding between two people who had lost everything and yet still chose to sit together under a star-filled sky." And for the first time since her world had burned, Lina closed her eyes, not in fear, but in rest. The moon was high and pale when the howl came, long, mournful, and far too close. Lina's eyes snapped open. She reached instinctively for Tahoma, who stirred but did not wake. Atsidi was already at the entrance of the crevice, crouched like a shadow, bow in hand. His face was stone, his breath silent. Lina crawled forward, heart pounding in her throat. "Wolves?" she whispered. Atsidi didn't answer right away. He listened. Another howl echoed, this one sharper, a warning, not a cry. "No," he said finally. "Dogs, trained, they're hunting." Panic rose in Lina's chest like a flood. "They found us?" she asked. "Not yet," he said, scanning the darkness. "But they're close, 2 hills away at most. The wind brought their scent too early. We have a little time, but not much." He turned to her, eyes locked with hers. "You have to trust me now." We moved before dawn. There was no time to argue, no time to gather thoughts, only what they could carry. Lina wrapped Tahoma in the blanket and held him tight as they slipped out into the freezing dark. The mountain was a black silhouette, its trails hidden beneath shadow and frost. Atsidi led them with quiet urgency, taking paths that barely seemed like paths at all. Sometimes he walked on stone to hide their footprints. Other times he bent saplings behind them to mask broken twigs. Every step was measured, deliberate. Behind them, faint barks rang through the night, chasing the silence like drums before war. Lina's legs burned. Her back ached from carrying Tahoma, but she never slowed. Fear made her light, and hope, fragile and trembling, gave her speed. Hours passed in fragments of frost and breath. When the sky began to pale with the promise of dawn, Atsidi stopped near a ridge where an old pine had fallen. Beneath its tangled roots was a hollow, large enough for them to crouch and rest. "We'll wait here," he said. "If the dogs pass us, we'll head north. There's a canyon where they won't follow." Lina crawled inside, holding Tahoma close. Her lips were cracked, her hands shaking, but she said nothing. Atsidi sat outside the hollow, legs crossed, bow across his knees. He looked like something older than the hills, part man, part memory, carved from the silence of the earth itself. "Why are you helping us?" she asked quietly. He turned his head slightly. "Because once, someone helped me." Then he paused. "And because your son looks at me like I'm not broken." Lina blinked hard. The cold bit at her eyes, but the tears came anyway. She reached out, her hand brushing his sleeve. "Then don't let him lose you too." Atsidi nodded once and said no more. As the sun crept over the ridge, painting the sky with bruised gold, the howls faded. For now, the dogs were gone, but the danger remained, waiting. And so did their fragile thread of survival, woven now with purpose and a promise unspoken. They moved again by midday, skirting the ridgeline where vultures circled overhead like black omens. Atsidi led them along game trails only he could see, his every movement purposeful, his silence unbroken except for the occasional warning whisper or motion of his hand. Lina followed with Tahoma clutched against her chest, her muscles tight with exhaustion, her eyes scanning for danger in every rustle of leaf or snap of twig. Yet something had shifted. She no longer walked behind Atsidi as a stranger trailing a guide. She moved with him now, mirroring his caution, reading the land through his rhythm. They were becoming a single will, a single instinct, molded by survival. By the time the sun dipped behind the cliffs, they reached the edge of the canyon, a massive wound in the earth, deep and winding, carved over centuries by snowmelt and storms. The walls were red and gold, streaked with ash-gray lines, and the wind howled through it like a voice long forgotten. "Canyon of Echoes," Atsidi said, eyes scanning the cliffside. "Spirits live here, the kind that remember everything." Lina didn't ask what that meant. She simply nodded, her legs trembling. Atsidi led them down a narrow path, barely wider than his foot, until they reached a ledge nestled between two boulders. There, hidden from above, was a flat space just large enough to lie down. "We rest here tonight," he said. "They won't track us into the canyon. Too dangerous. Even hounds turn back." He pointed to the shadows. Too many broken bones in the dark. They built no fire. Instead, they shared a pouch of roasted pine seeds and drank the last of the melted snow water. Tahoma lay curled between them, snoring softly, unaware of the hunger or the danger that pulsed just beyond the ledge. Lina stared at the stars overhead, framed by stone and silence. "Did you ever think you'd be back here?" she asked quietly. Atsidi shook his head. "No, I swore I'd never return. Too many ghosts." Lina shifted to look at him. "Then why come?" He was quiet a moment, then said, "Because sometimes the ghosts are all that's left to guide you." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Their silence had grown familiar now, an understanding deeper than speech. Atsidi's hand rested near hers on the stone, and though they didn't touch, the distance between them had never felt smaller. The canyon echoed with wind and memory, and the past pressed in on them from every crevice. But they had not broken. Not yet. As the night deepened, Lina closed her eyes, holding Tahoma close. For the first time she dreamed, not of fire and screams, but of running water and open skies. And just before she woke, she saw Atsidi walking beside her through a wide valley, sunlight on their backs and no shadows in sight. The dream faded, but the feeling remained. Hope, raw and new, like the first breath after drowning. The canyon shielded them through the next 2 days, wrapping them in its stone arms as they moved deeper into the winding paths. Atsidi seemed to know every turn, every echo, every place where the rocks crumbled underfoot or the wind changed direction. Lina asked once how he knew the way, and he answered without looking back, "I was raised near here. My mother's people brought me when I was small. I ran these cliffs before I ever touched a bow." It was the most he'd shared in days, and Lina held on to it like a precious coal in winter. The silence between them had grown soft, no longer cold or guarded, but comfortable, like old tree bark worn smooth from weather and time. On the third afternoon, they reached a place Atsidi had not spoken of. A shallow basin carved into the red rock, surrounded by a circle of stones marked with old charcoal symbols. Bones lay scattered among the dust, small, brittle, sun-bleached. "We stop here," he said, voice different now, rougher. "This was my clan's last fire." Lina paused, feeling the weight in the air shift. "You brought us to your home," she said softly. "To what's left of it." Atsidi nodded. "This is where they were burned, the ones who didn't run fast enough." He crouched near the stones, fingertips brushing a blackened mark. "I buried my sister here. She was 9. They caught her trying to lead our dog away so it wouldn't bark." Lina knelt beside him, saying nothing. There were no words to match grief that had settled into bone-like rain into dry earth. Tahoma wandered nearby, quiet, drawn to the gentle slope of the basin, the scattered feathers caught in thorn bushes, the way the light poured in from above like a blessing. Atsidi watched him. "He reminds me of her," he said. "Same eyes, same way of looking at the world like it might be kind." That evening they gathered dry brush and built a small fire, not for cooking but for memory. Atsidi lit it with a coal from his pouch and placed a carved bead into the flame. Smoke curled upward, twisting into the sky like a song. "We speak their names," he said, "not for the dead, but for the living who carry them." He looked at Lina. She nodded. "Elan," she said, "my husband." Atsidi added, "Sani, my father, Dana, my sister." Then silence. The fire cracked. The canyon listened. Tahoma, barely awake, mumbled, "I want to remember too." Lina wrapped him in the blanket, her throat tightening. "You will," she whispered. "You will remember all of them." As night fell, the ashes drifted into the wind and vanished among the stars. And in that sacred stillness, something shifted again. The past no longer chased them like dogs in the night. Now it walked beside them, still heavy, still real, but no longer alone. For the first time, they were not just surviving, they were remembering. And remembering was its own kind of home. By morning, the air smelled of frost and old pine, and a light mist hung over the canyon like a veil. Atsidi rose before the others, his silhouette barely visible against the dim light, perched on a ledge that overlooked the basin of ash and bones. Lina stirred beneath the blanket, her body aching from days of walking and crouching in stone shelters. Tahoma remained asleep beside her, his lips parted slightly, his chest rising and falling with the easy rhythm of childhood. It was a rare gift, peace in a place that had once tasted only of death. But they couldn't stay here. Atsidi had said as much the night before. "Too many paths lead here, too many memories. We need somewhere the wind doesn't talk back." That morning, after a final prayer over the ashes, they left the basin behind, climbing higher into the cliffs. The path was treacherous, carved into the mountain itself, one misstep from 100-foot fall. Lina didn't ask where they were going. She no longer needed to. She had come to trust Atsidi's instincts more than her own fear. By midday, the canyon opened up into a hidden gorge, a crack in the earth so narrow it could vanish from sight if you didn't know where to look. At its mouth was a rock face covered in ancient petroglyphs. Animals, spirals, handprints pressed into stone by people long gone. "This is it," Atsidi said. "A place forgotten even by the ones who remember." They passed through the gap and into a hollowed-out chamber in the cliffside. A shallow cave, dry and warm, with a trickle of water that fell from a moss-covered lip above. Tahoma clapped his hands with joy. "A house!" he shouted, laughter echoing off the walls. Lina smiled for the first time in days, not the tight, polite curve of lips, but a real smile, full and aching. "It's perfect," she said. Atsidi began reinforcing the entrance with stone and brush, making the cave less visible from the outside. Lina helped him, matching his rhythm, her hands moving without needing instruction. They worked silently, but together. That night they ate the last of their rations and made plans to hunt and forage again. Atsidi drew a small map in the dirt with a stick, water sources, game trails, sun paths, while Tahoma watched with wide eyes, absorbing everything. "He learns fast," Atsidi said. Faster than I did." As darkness settled over their hidden refuge, Lina tucked Tahoma against her and leaned back against the stone wall. "Do you think we could stay?" she asked. Atsidi didn't answer right away. Then he said, "Not forever, but long enough to breathe." He placed his knife beside him, close but not clenched, long enough to remember what safety feels like. And as sleep took them, one by one, curled together beneath the breath of the mountain, there was no sound but the drip of water, the hush of wind, and the heartbeat of a life slowly being rebuilt, stone by stone. The days began to blend, slow and steady like the drip of water from the cave ceiling. Each sunrise brought tasks that no longer felt like survival, but like living. Atsidi taught Tahoma how to follow rabbit tracks in soft soil, how to listen for birds that signaled nearby movement, how to tell which berries stained the tongue with sweetness and which carried poison. Lina gathered roots, learned to bind wounds with willow bark, and found herself humming songs she hadn't sung since girlhood. In the quiet of the gorge, something tender began to take root: routine, rhythm, and the aching comfort of almost forgetting the world outside. Atsidi changed too. He no longer watched the ridgeline every morning with suspicion. His knife stayed in its sheath longer each day. He carved more: birds, fish, small mountain cats, each figure smooth and delicate, his calloused hands gentle in their work. One evening, after a shared meal of roasted squirrel and wild onions, he gave Lina a carved necklace: 3 figures, a bird, a child, and a bear. "For protection," he said. "The bird for spirit, the child for hope, the bear for strength." Lina's fingers trembled as she accepted it. She didn't speak, but the way she looked at him said enough. Gratitude, understanding, something else. But peace in the wild is always temporary. That night the wind changed. It blew harder, sharper, carrying with it the faintest trace of ash. Atsidi stood at the cave entrance, his body still but his senses alive. "Someone lit a fire," he said. Lina came to his side. "Is it them?" she asked. "I don't know," he replied. "It's far, but not far enough to ignore." The next morning they packed quietly, just in case. The cave had become theirs, but it was not a fortress. It could not protect them from men who burned villages and sent hounds to tear through silence. Atsidi scouted the ridge while Lina gathered supplies. When he returned, he carried a different look. Worry, not just for her, but for something deeper. "I saw boot prints," he said. "Not old, not Apache. Settlers, maybe, or bounty men." Lina's heart sank. "Do they know we're here?" Atsidi shook his head. "I don't think so. But they're close. Too close." He sat beside her, his jaw tense. "You have a choice," he said softly. "There's a river 2 days east. I can take you there. There are people, quiet ones, who owe my father a kindness. You and Tahoma could stay. Be safe." Lina's breath caught. "And you?" Atsidi looked away. "I don't stay." Silence stretched between them like a canyon. Then Lina reached for his hand. "You could. Just this once." And in that moment, under the hush of mountain wind, with Tahoma sleeping soundly behind them, Atsidi didn't answer. But he didn't pull away either. Sometimes the fiercest choice isn't to run or fight or hide. Sometimes it's to stay. The morning they left the cave, the sky was copper and bruised, smeared with the promise of storm. They packed quickly, just what could be carried on their backs, and wrapped the tools they couldn't take in animal hides, burying them under loose stone and thorn brush. "In case we return," Lina said. Atsidi didn't answer, but his glance at the cave entrance lingered long, as if imprinting its shape into memory. They moved with purpose, silent, but not afraid. The boy was light on his feet now, his eyes sharper, quicker. He walked beside Atsidi instead of clinging to Lina, mimicking the hunter's every move. It made her heart ache in ways she hadn't expected. The journey to the river was hard. The storm broke midday, drenching them with cold rain and turning the ground to thick clay. Still they pressed on, weaving through cedar groves and shale-strewn hills, following the faint whisper of water that grew louder with each step. By the time the river came into view, a wide silver ribbon slicing through the land. The sun had broken through the clouds, and the world shimmered like it had been washed clean. Across the water, a group of huts stood half hidden by trees. Smoke curled from one chimney. A woman in a red shawl knelt by the bank, scrubbing hides. When she saw them, she didn't run. She stood slowly, watching as Atsidi raised a hand in greeting and crossed the river, the water rising to his waist. Lina and Tahoma waited on the near bank, their breath tight in their chests. Then, after a long exchange of words and nods, the woman called into the trees. Others came, 2 elders, a man with a walking stick, a girl with braided hair, faces full of weather and time, but not anger, not fear, welcome. Atsidi returned and said only, "They remember my father." They were given food, dry clothes, a hut with a clay hearth and mats soft enough to dream on. That night, Tahoma slept without stirring, and Lina sat at the doorway, watching the fireflies dance between reeds. Atsidi stood nearby, his pack still slung over his shoulder. "You're leaving," she said. It wasn't a question. "I don't belong here," he said quietly. "I never did." Lina rose, stepped toward him. "You belong where you're needed, where you're trusted. That used to be nowhere. Now." She reached out, fingers brushing his. "Now you have a place, if you choose it." He looked down at her hand, then at the boy inside, curled like a pup near the fire. The silence stretched, then broke, not with words, but with motion. Atsidi let the pack fall from his shoulder, slowly, deliberately. "Just for tonight," he said. But when morning came, he was still there. And when the boy woke and asked if they go hunting later, Atsidi simply nodded. Not every warrior rides off when the smoke clears. Some stay. Some become fathers. Some become home. And in a village by the river, under the watch of the mountains, a lost hunter finally stayed.